going to continue in our study in 1 Corinthians, and this is lesson 5. So we're going to continue looking at chapter 3, verses 5 through 23. And this is really dealing with the subject of teachers of the church, and in a sense, the importance of it, the roles, responsibilities, how we need to be thinking about things. Because if you remember at the close of our last lesson, Paul was sort of unfolding evidence as to where, that there were divisions in Corinth. And the reasons were that they really had a faulty view of leadership. They had a faulty view of, in particular, teachers in the church, because they were talking about divisions that are going on. And in verse 4, he says, when one says, I follow Paul, and another says, I follow Apollos, are you not being merely human? Now, that's not like, okay, you're just, people. He's saying your thinking is not God's way of thinking. You're thinking just like men. Oh, this guy's more special than that guy. And so it's not a spiritual way. In other words, there is no wisdom in what they're really doing. They're not looking at things from God's perspective. They're looking at it from being merely human, if you will. And so he's now going to pick up and he's going to say, okay, you guys keep saying this kind of stuff, but let me explain to you who Paul and Apollos and Cephas really are. And this is how we're going to have to examine their thinking and then the roles of these people. Because again, divisions are when people think one person is, greater than the other. And so he picks up and he says, all right, let me explain to you who we really are and what's really important in this entire role. So he really is going to say, look, guys, we're really nothing. It's God. God is the one who's important here. So let's watch and see how he goes through this argument. He says, what then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. For he who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are fellow workers. We are God's field, God's building. Okay? So we see that Paul has laid out, and he's going to say, let me explain to you who we really are. And in a sense, he's saying, not who we are, because we're Paul, we're Apollos, we're Cephas, we're whoever we are. But he's really going to say, let me explain to you what we are. Don't look at us as individuals. Hey, this guy can speak better than that guy. This guy knows more about this than that person. This guy's suffered more for the gospel. Not who we are, but what we are. And that's what he's going to say. He says, what then is Apollos? What is Paul? And he starts off and he says, servants. And he basically says, look, I'm nothing. Apollos is nothing. We're just servants. We are those who have placed ourselves under the authority of Christ. We are the ones who are in a position of serving. And as he starts looking at this, he says, but in our serving, we have different roles. And in this particular case, I was a planter and Apollos was a waterer. In other words, we are the ones who have a role to perform. And this is something that we're going to see as we press on in the book of 1 Corinthians. He's going to keep coming back to this. Yes, everybody is important. Everybody has been given gifts. Everybody has a role because the body needs all that. If you just planted and you didn't water, what would happen? Nothing. If you just poured water on the ground, there was no seed in it, what would happen? Nothing. So both roles are valuable, they're useful, they're necessary, and each person plays a different role in ministry and in service. And he's saying, so think of us as servants. That's what we are. Because what we do is not so much the important thing, it's who we serve. We are servants of God, and therefore, who is the one who's ultimately going to bring growth, which is what you want to see. That's God. He says, but God have the growth. Okay, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. He's the one who gave growth. So he says, neither who plants nor who waters is anything, but only God. So if you could already see that he's already talking about, well, why are you guys having divisions? Why are you saying you're one of us, or, you think this person's better? He says it's about God, not about us. So just beginning in their thought process, they're starting with men. You're being merely human and not being, vertically centered and looking at who God is and what he has done. Now, each one of them has the same goal, though, because look what he also says. He who plants and he who waters are one. You're saying, well, how can they be one? Well, they're one in purpose. They're one in objective. They're one in goal. And he says each of us have the same desire. We want to, as we're going to see, we're going to build on who Christ is, and we're going to teach, and we're going to help you learn, and we're going to help you understand things. But each of us has our specific task. And what's interesting about this is he says in verse 8, he says, he who plants and he who waters are one, which is what we just talked about, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. Now, a lot of times we sit here and we go, well, wait a second, I thought we're all one and there's, we have Christ, etc. But that's true. But the Bible also talks about that each one is going to have a reward. We don't get a lot of detail about that. There's glimpses and pieces, throughout Scripture that talk about what that reward is. And of course, just being with Christ and, being a joint heir with him, having all that he has, basically says you have everything. But specifically, God's looking and saying, you do have a reward that comes with your work. We don't have a lot of detail of what that means, though. We just know that ultimately there's spiritual reward. Now, there may be temporal reward. God may say, here's your role in time and space. There's some things that are going to come along with it. But how would you like Paul's temporal reward? Hey, I've been beaten, thrown off ships, scourged, thrown in prison. Yeah, thank you for that reward. But see, he says, that's not what I'm doing. That's not why I'm doing it. But if you are a servant and you are going to receive a reward for what you do, there is temporal importance to what we do. And we're going to see, he's going to talk about, if you're not doing the right thing, you're in trouble. God is not going to be pleased with that. And there may be a point where, yes, you may be saved, but you will have no reward. So reward in this context is an important idea, an important notion. And he says in verse 9 then, for we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. And so he's been using this agricultural idea that he says, we are God's fellow workers. In other words, we are working in conjunction with God and what he is doing and his purposes. And you, Corinthians, and all those who we're ministering to, you're God's field. In other words, using the planting and watering analogy, what we're trying to do within you, and this is the church in general, not just individuals, he's trying to plant seed and bring about growth. And God's going to be the one who's working with them in that, with their roles and God doing the growing. And that should teach us a little bit about how we should be looking at, well, this person didn't do this and this person didn't get that. We still have to live in an earthly world, but we have to realize that you can plant well, you can water well, and you look at it and say, but there's no growth. Well, where's the growth? Well, that's by God's hand. And we can sometimes think that we're God and I'm just going to make them do that. I'm going to make them. It's going to be forced and we're going to be frustrated because we're going to make that growth. God is the one who's doing it. So be a fellow worker with God. Don't think you're God or I think I'm God. God is the one who is in charge of it, and we are fellow workers in that whole process. And so he uses that you're God's field, which matches the analogy he's going to do. But now he's going to say, he's also say God's building. Now it's interesting. It can also be God's sanctuary, God's temple, God's structure, whatever you want to call it. And he's going to take this idea of a building now. He's used the agricultural analogy of a field, and now he's going to use the analogy of a building to say, okay, let me help you understand how you're supposed to think. And the second thing is, you better build carefully. And so this is in verses 10 through 15. Let's see what he says. He says, according to the grace of God, again, given to me, all right, so he's been given this, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Christ Jesus. And now if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stone, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it. Because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. Okay, there's a lot in that. But let's look at it. He's now going to say, let me explain to you the how and the what of his building efforts. He says, okay, according to the grace of God given to me. So he says, God's grace has given me this task. This is in God's grace. He says, that is how I am doing my building, if you will. And he says, like a skilled master builder. So again, he's giving us an analogy. He's saying, all right, let me think about what a skilled master builder was. And in those days, it's not like today we have big engineering firms and you got this guy who does this and this guy who does this and this guy who does this. A master builder kind of said, I understand how buildings go together. I'm the one who's going to guide the structure. And in particular, the thing that was the most important to any building, now and in the past, is the foundation. If you don't have the right foundation, if you've ever been in a place where it's foundation warped, it's cracked, it's broken, the structure gets, if you will, cattywampus, to use an old Southern expression. Things just don't look right. They don't stay right. I want the chandelier hanging perfectly over my table, and it's kind of like this because the floor is warped. And you're kind of like, how does that work? This doesn't fit right. And so he says, I'm a skilled master builder. That's my job. Now, it doesn't mean I'm building everything, but I'm going to be the one who's going to lay it out, look at the structure, put it in, and make sure the foundation is in there. Because once the foundation is there, everything else then can be built well on it. Doesn't say it will be, but can be. Because if you notice here, he says, I laid the foundation and someone else is building on it. Now, of course, Apollos built on it, other people have built on it, and now the leaders, the teachers in Corinth are building on it. And he says, let each one take care how he builds on it. So he's now going to give a warning. He's like, all right, you got the foundation, but you better be careful how you build on it. Because even with a perfect foundation, you can get walls not square and things don't put together and you got holes and gaps and all sorts of things. And he says again, for no one can lay a foundation other than the one that's laid, which is Christ Jesus. So there's some intimation here or some potential that he's going, some of you guys may be trying to substitute or put a different foundation or add another foundation onto it. If you try to do that, you've got a problem because this building, this structure only has one foundation and it's Christ, not Christ and. So that's the only foundation you lay. So if you're building on anything else or trying to add anything else to that foundation, we have a problem. And so be careful how you build. You can't add anything else to it. He says, now, if anyone builds on the foundation, okay, he's now saying, all right, if you're not going to build on that foundation, he's now going to give us two classes of materials. Gold, if they build with gold, silver, precious stones, that's one class. Wood, hay, straw, that's a second class. And if you think about this, when Paul's talking, he says, look, if you're building with gold and silver and precious stones, well, of course, that's something valuable. And we're going to see here in a second, it's something that, if you will, from their perspective and in normal senses, it's going to survive testing. It's going to survive a fire. And then you have the common things, the wood, hay, straw, the less valuable, the things that aren't that important. And what is going to happen when those things get tested, and in this analogy, with fire? They're going to burn up. He says, so you're building, and if you build with this class of material, whatever that looks like, in other words, the right things, properly done, with value, with care, with consideration, there's going to be some profit in it. And if you build sloppily, if you will, with things that are not that important, hey, I'm just going to stick that on there, and you're not paying really attention to what's going on, there's going to be a problem with it. Now, can you build a house out of straw? Yes, you can. Can you build out a house out of wood? Yes. Can you build out of hay? Yes. Can you build out of gold and precious silver? Yes. But that's not the point. Again, these are classes of material. So he's trying to say beautiful, honorable, wonderful, well done, excellence, whatever, not very tough, not very holding up. In other words, it's not going to be something that you're going to be able to count on. And that's exactly what he continues on and he says. Each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it. And in this particular thing, he's saying the day. In other words, this is a day of judgment. And this isn't the day of the living and the dead type of a judgment. This is a judgment of believers, because God's house is going to be judged. We're going to be judged for our works. And we all know that we've sinned, we failed, we've done other things. But he says also, I'm going to judge you for how you're working. And in particular, in this particular example, Paul's saying, look, you teachers, you leaders, you pastors, you shepherds, whoever, you're going to be judged of how you build upon this. Well, parents, how are you going to build upon the foundation if your children know the Lord? What kind of foundation are you building? Are you sloppy? Do you care? Husbands, wives, all the different things that God has given us. What kind of foundation are we building on? And secondly, what kind of quality material and workmanship are we putting into it? Is it first class or last class, if you will? He says, for that day is going to disclose it, because how is it going to be revealed? Again, in the analogy, by fire. And fire will test what sort of work has done. So again, that's, if you notice, that's why these two classes of materials are being talked about. If the work, as anyone built on the foundation, survives, he will receive a reward. So again, what's the reward? Gold and silver and jewels, if you will. It's quality. It won't be burned up by fire. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss. Wood, hay, stubble. This class of stuff is sloppy, poor, not well done. It's going to burn up in the fire when tested. It really was of little value to the building. Matter of fact, it could be dangerous to the building. He said, so that's going to be burned up and you're going to suffer loss. Now, very often we try to go, okay, well, you did a bad job, so you're not saved. And you did a great job, so you're saved. We're not talking about salvation here. As a matter of fact, Paul is going to make that very clear, because look what he says. He says, they will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved. In other words, this is more about your sanctification than your justification, and how you live your life versus who you put your trust in. Because you're building, but what kind of things are you building with? Because that person who will be saved, but as only through fire. And what happens when you go through a fire and you don't have anything of value or protection? You come out smoked and all. It's like, oh, I got nothing. And he says, that's how you're going to come through this. So be careful. That's why he says, let each one take care how he builds upon it. So if you notice here, Paul is going back and saying, you guys have been thinking merely human about us. You've been thinking in an earthly way about us. We're servants. We're one. We have the same purpose of God. You are a field, one planted, one watered. And then you are a building. And you are the one who I've laid this foundation as a skilled master builder. Now others are building upon it. So be careful about how you build. And therefore, because it's going to be tested, it's going to be tried. Is there value? Are you doing good work? This is a scary passage when you start thinking about being a parent, being a teacher, being a pastor, being anybody, because you are building upon that foundation of Christ in some way, shape, or form. Be careful how you build, because there's great reward in the right building materials, if you will, and there is great loss in the improper. Do you want to spend your entire life working and saying, I did the right thing, and you find out that you didn't because you weren't paying any attention? You're just kind of going through the motions. So he says, be careful how you build. So this is, if you will, sort of a backhanded thing about these folks are saying, is this how your teachers are building? Is this how your leaders are building? Are they being gold, silver, and precious jewels? Or are you getting wood, hay, and stubble, if you will, or straw? That's not going to hold up. So be careful, guys, how you think, how you act, and how you build. And so now he takes that same building idea, and it's using the same word that in verse 16 and 17. He now shifts the analogy into not just a building, because it is a building, but a building that's a temple. And it says, this is, the temple of God. It says, do you not know you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. Now, if you thought you had a challenge when he says, be careful how you build, he's now saying, oh, by the way, the building is God's temple. Okay, that's like, wow, this is, what would they see in Corinth, and what would they see in Judaism, and what would they see in any of these times? The temple is the place of God's dwelling. And we know the Spirit of God dwells within us, and all these other kinds of things. Now, let me take a pause here real quick, because very often, maybe you've seen this and maybe you haven't, very often you see that this verse is pulled out of its context. And if you notice, we've been walking through in context. You can see how this works in context. But if you pull it out of context, people can go, oh, you're God's temple, you individually. Well, this you is plural. It's used individually elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, but that reading shouldn't be read over the top of this one. It says, you are God's temple, and God's Spirit dwells in you. Okay, and if you're thinking you singular, you're thinking me, me, me. Well, this is you plural, means you, you, and it means the church. As if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. Well, that verse is very often, inappropriately, and I know I've done it in the past myself, pulled out of its context and say, oh, see, suicide's wrong, God will destroy you if you destroy yourself. So it's unpardonable if you commit suicide. That's not what this verse is talking about. If you notice here, Paul's been talking about teachers and building and instruction and God's purpose, and that you need to build wisely. And that's why he says, do you not know that you all, y'all, are God's temple? And God's Spirit dwells within y'all, if you will. And so every single person here is part of God's temple. And we see that in 1 Peter 2. We're living stones, right? We're stones in that temple. That's that whole analogy that we corporately make up that temple, because that's the place of God's dwelling. So the whole analogy works, except instead of saying God dwells here in this place, God dwells in these people. And this is why people get so confused with a church building as somewhere, this is where God is, and well, if you step outside, he's not. No, he's in us. Wherever we go, God's temple is there. God's presence is there. And now you begin to see when he says, if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. And so what is really going on here? What kind of analogy is he really trying to make when he says, if anyone destroys God's temple? What do you think? Yeah, he's talking about people. What else? Yeah, he is talking in a way that they should connect it with what's going on in Corinth. That's true. But if you really think about what he's trying to say here, he's saying, look, you people in Corinth are God's temple. And if anyone destroys you, this church, these believers, and you are being destroyed by that person. In other words, that person, if you notice in the analogy, is not building wisely, is not doing the right thing, is causing trouble, is putting a different foundation, or whatever it is, to harm you, God's going to go after them. And the language here is actually strong. It talks about that if anyone destroys God's temple, or God will destroy him, this is like bring to ruin. And from the context, you can't necessarily say, well, this means that they're going to lose their salvation. It's possible. I mean, it could be that strong that, if you do this, you really aren't saved, because if you're doing this, God's going to destroy you. Or it could be that, hey, you as a leader, you as a person in the church, you are causing this kind of trouble. God's going to bring you down. He's going to cause accountability that's going to come with this. And again, we can't tell. But we can tell one thing. He says, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. Well, how jealous is God for his temple and his people, and the holiness and the sanctity and the purity I mean, all of the Old Testament kept pointing, purity, 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 sanctity, holiness, set apartness. Here's the purpose. And here he's saying, this is what you guys are like. And if that's not happening, that's destroying that temple. That's the same idea. And I'm going to come after you. All right, if you notice here, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. It's like, whoa, maybe you need to stop thinking like that. Maybe you need to start thinking, I'm of God and we're God's people and we need to show love and concern. And we're going to see, Paul's going to take these same arguments as we move through the book, and we're going to see how he brings up the idea of knowledge and love and giftedness and body and everybody working together, and each person and each part has a purpose. Again, we're God's fellow workers. And so if you notice here, he does not want this to happen. He says, so if you think this is a good thing, it isn't. It's a bad thing. So let's now look at our last piece. And this is, what does it mean to be truly wise? Because he's going to tell us here in verses 18 through 23. He's going to say, you guys now need to start thinking different. You need to start understanding what true wisdom is. And so let's read this 18 through 23. It says, let no one deceive himself. In other words, don't become self-deceived. If anyone among you thinks he is wise in this age, let him become a fool that he might become wise. Which is kind of strange language, but we'll talk about that. For the wisdom of this world is folly for God. For it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. So let no one boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours. And you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. You're like, where's he going with all this? Well, let's walk through it. He says, so let no one deceive himself. So in other words, what this is warning us is we can become self-deceived. We can be thinking we're right, thinking we're doing the right thing, thinking we're building with gold and silver and precious jewels, and we're not. Let no one deceive himself. And now he's really going to put this in a context about wisdom. And he says, if anyone among you thinks he is wise, notice he says, in this age. Okay, in this age. In other words, this is of the age of the men, if you will. This is, if you think at this time, according to the world, you need to become a fool that you might actually become wise. And if you notice, remember, back we talked about this, that God's wisdom is foolishness to men. So he says, if you think you're wise in this age, you need to become a fool so you really can become wise. Because true wisdom is from God, not from men. So don't deceive yourself into thinking you have all these wonderful arguments and it sounds really great. You think you're wise, you need to become a fool so you can become really wise, truly wise, God wise, if you will. It says, for the wisdom of this world, again, pointing back that if you think you're wise, is folly to God. It says, with God, what you think is wise is folly. For it is written, and this is where he captures it and takes some Old Testament verses and he pulls in here. He says, he catches the wise in their craftiness. In other words, you're not going to fool God. You can be as crafty as you want. God will catch you. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. In other words, every silly thing that you think in this world, you're going to be, I got God here. Well, I got a better argument. God says, it's foolish. I'm God. Remember that thing called omniscience? I know everything. You're not going to fool me. I know exactly where your heart is. I know your thoughts, and they're futile. They're futile. And we see these types of ideas in the Psalms. Why do the nations rage? And God's going to, sits on his throne and he laughs. In other words, guys, it's futile. It's a waste of time. So stop trying to be so wise in the world. And that doesn't mean be dumb. Okay, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking, if your earthly wisdom, if you think that that's going to get you anywhere with God, it isn't. Become a fool and to become truly wise. God will catch you. God says your thoughts are futile. Don't even think about it. So he says, so let no one boast in men. Isn't that what he started with? You say, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. Are you not thinking merely human? Remember how we are? We are merely servants. We are co-workers. We are those who are working with God. We are one in purpose with him and with each other. Even though we have different roles, we'll have different responsibilities, we'll have different rewards. That's fine. But he says, if you do anything, don't boast in men. You should not be boasting in men. This is ridiculous. For all things are yours. And you're going, well, I shouldn't boast in men, for all things are mine. All things are mine. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or present or future. Isn't it interesting? He says, everything, you have everything because you have Christ. Because Christ owns everything and Christ is God's. And so in this, you have everything in him. So it doesn't matter what it is. You have it in him. And he is in God's hands, if you will. So, no one can snatch them out of my Father's hands. No one can do that. So Jesus is basically saying, you're mine, I'm yours, and God has us all in his hands. Nothing can get to you. So he says, well, why are you worrying about whether I'm Paul and Apollos or Cephas or anybody else, or any of your leaders in Corinth or anything else? And why do you have all these divisions? You shouldn't have any of these divisions. You've got everything. And where do you find it? You find it in Christ. So he said, look, this is where true wisdom comes from. This is what it means to be truly wise. But be careful how you build, how you think, how you act, and how you interrelate with each other. Because God is not happy if people are destroying his church, if people are causing trouble in his church. Matter of fact, in chapter 5, we're going to see that a divisive man or a factious man can even be right, but by the way they're doing something, they're factious, they're creating problems. So sometimes you even have to be careful of I'm so right, I'm wrong. And again, we'll see how this all flows out. We have to be careful about all these things. Otherwise, we become man-centered. Now, one thing I do want to say in closing, in application, because sometimes, when we hear this stuff, we get all locked into our heads. But it is okay to say, look, this person speaks to me at where I am in my life better than that person. This person I have a closer affinity with. This one uses words I understand. This one uses words I appreciate. This one, I just resonate with them. They're warmer or whatever. Or I like that person because they're more straightforward. There's nothing wrong with any of those things, okay? In and of themselves. Where the danger is when you start raising one person or one thing over everybody else and saying, now that's what you got to be. That's the right answer. Versus, at this point in my life, where I am, as God's used me and my life experience and their person and their personality and their life experience, this is who I may prefer to listen to. That's okay. But not, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, it's me against them. There's no us against them. There's all of us together as co-workers, as fellow servants, unto one purpose. We're one in all of this. So again, I just want to make sure you understand that there's nothing wrong with having preferences, okay? Because we all do. We don't all eat green Jell-O, Some people like red, some people like orange, some people like lemon lime. So it's okay. But again, it's one purpose. Everything we're doing is one. And therefore there's wisdom in that, there's love in that, there's graciousness in that. And Paul is now going to continue, as we look into these next weeks, we're going to see that he's going to continue with those same ideas. So let's be careful about faction and division and problems and one person over another, because that's not what we should be looking about. And that can cause destruction in the church, and that is a bad thing. We don't want any of that. So I hope that makes sense, and we'll pick up chapter 4 next lesson.